Nisha. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to each and every one of you for joining us for the fifth Dvara Research Conference on the theme of household finance. My name is Misha Sharma. I lead the household finance practice in Dvara Research, and I will be your host for today. We're very pleased to bring to you this conference in collaboration with Omidyar Network, TransUnion Civil, Robert Bosch Center for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at IIT Madras, Dvara KGFS, and Dvara Trust. Over the next 5 days, we will uncover some important insights about the financial lives of low-income households and reflect on how these findings can be translated into better products and policies for the traditionally excluded segments. This year's conference is centered around the theme of household finance. Household finance, very simply put, is about understanding how households use financial and non-financial strategies to achieve their life cycle goals. At Dvara, we broadly categorize the field of household finance into the what, why, and how. The what theme looks at what are the financial decisions and strategies made by households, what are the ways in which households borrow, save, spend. The why theme looks at why do households behave the way they do, and the how theme looks at how does the provision of formal financial services affect household outcomes and their overall well-being. The research, as well as the expert conversations and keynote speeches presented during the conference, will cut across these themes, and we hope to build a strong pool of evidence towards documenting and understanding household financial behavior. With that, I would now like to invite Samir Shah, Executive Vice Chair, Group President, and Managing Trustee, Dvara Trust, to open the conference with his welcome remarks. Thank you, Samir, for joining us for the conference, and over to you.
Thank you, Misha. It's a pleasure to open this conference, and it's a real pleasure to see this conference come alive in the context of what has been and continues to be a very difficult last 12 to 15 months. But nevertheless, a quick warm welcome to everyone. Good afternoon to those of you in the Indian time zone. Good morning to those of you dialing in from US and other locations as well. Uh, I'm excited about kicking off this conference. But before I give some background into this particular conference, a little bit of background on Dvara Trust. Dvara Trust has been a financial inclusion platform that was set up in 2008 with a real sort of single-minded mission of trying to achieve financial inclusion for every individual and every enterprise. And the mission was about trying to ensure that every individual and every enterprise has complete access to financial services. One of the key pillars of work for Dvara Trust, comes from the work that Dvara Research Foundation does. And this conference is, of course, hosted by Dvara Research Foundation. And it's a very important part of the overall focus of Dvara, which looks at financial systems, financial inclusion from a perspective, from a thought leadership perspective. But more importantly, that thought leadership is based on a real ground up understanding of what is happening in the financial system and with low income households and enterprises. It is one of the leading financial systems policy research institutions in the country. And its identity is to be really the voice, is to stand for the voice of its main primary stakeholder, which is the low income household, and to be the advocate for the well being of such low income households. So it's a fairly unique lens that Dvara Research applies to all of its work, which is to provide the lens of the consumer, which is quite unique in the way it approaches its thinking and the way it looks at building together research and evidence around the points of view that Dvara Research has undertaken over the last so many years. Uh, it does work in a very holistic manner, largely around uh, four practices, as we call them, in so largely around four practices. The first practice is what we call as financial systems design. The second is a more recent practice. It's called the future of finance. The third is the social protection initiative. And the final practice, which is really anchoring this conference, is the household finance practice. Dwara Research's legacy has really been in, as I mentioned earlier, providing thought leadership in a very grounded manner, and building a very well functioning and resilient financial system in order to achieve financial inclusion. And the conference serves as a very high quality platform for disseminating this thought leadership. So this is the fifth edition of the Dwara Research Conference, and it has taken a fairly unique format this year. The work in planning this conference started about a year ago, where our leadership teams and research teams identified 10 very outstanding research teams and commissioned these research teams to conduct research on various aspects of household finance. So the theme of this fifth uh, edition of Dwara Research Conference is going to be household finance. Um, the idea of this conference, as I mentioned earlier, is to engage with a community of extremely high quality researchers who are interested in studying topics at the intersection of financial inclusion and household finance, to bring about focus on building a demand side perspective. And that's really the differentiating part of this conference, which is to look at the demand side perspectives, barriers, preferences, household context, financial circumstances, to the goal of universal access to finance. And this is probably the first, I would say, real serious documentation of experiences and insights that are coming through the pandemic. Because a lot of the research has been done over the last 12 months, which means that it has sort of the benefit of really studying at close encounters what has happened to demand side perspectives of low income households through the pandemic. Um, these 10 research teams have collected primary data from close to 10 states, so very representative of what's happening in the country, and have covered broadly the themes of financial planning and savings, portfolio choices of low income and migrant households, identifying financially vulnerable households using applied data science techniques, and finally measuring farmers' distress, which is a very important topic, again, in the context of the pandemic and everything that we've been seeing about the farmer protests and their use of crop insurance in a very specific manner. Needless to say, it has been a very challenging year to plan, prepare, and put together this conference, especially conducting primary research, given the lockdowns and the various stages of the pandemic as it has progressed through wave 2. We are extremely thankful to the teams to have contributed towards the goal of this program and joining us for this virtual conference. I wish all the teams, all our participants, our entire audience a very successful conference, and I hope and we are very hopeful as Dvara Group to use the insights of this conference into building solutions towards the design and delivery of financial services for low-income households. So with that, it's an honor to kick off this conference, and I'd like to hand back the mic to Misha.
Thank you so much, Samir, for setting the tone for the conference. We will now actually move to actually the first part of the agenda for today, which is the research presentation scheduled on the theme of portfolios of migrant households. And needless to say, this topic is of great importance. Studying migrant households has become particularly important at a time when they have been arguably the most affected by COVID-19 pandemic. The World Bank had already predicted a long and sustained negative impact of COVID-19 on migrant households in South Asia. And this would have only exacerbated in India with the outbreak of a deadlier second wave that has necessitated the imposition of further rounds of lockdowns in almost all parts of the country. So therefore, over the next 1 hour, we will focus on understanding the financial vulnerabilities of migrant households, the financial status quo in terms of their access to and use of formal financial services. And really, we have two stellar research teams, one which is led by the lead team at Kriya University. And the second research presentation on this topic is by Grameen Foundation. So we will have these two research presentations first, one by one, and then we will move on to the reflections on the larger theme and the research presented by a sector expert. So I would now like to hand it over to my colleagues at the lead team. But before I do so, just wanted to say that this session is being live streamed on the conference website. You will see a chat box on the right hand side of your screen. So to the audience, please drop your questions on the right hand side of the chat box, and we will make sure that we pass on your questions to the panelists and to the speakers. And if possible, please also mention your name while dropping in your questions, as that will be very helpful. So with that, I would now like to invite Fabrizio Valenti, Vineet Kumar, and Shashank Sridharan from the lead team for the first presentation of the day. Fabrizio, thank you so much for joining. Really happy to have you. And we know that this has been a 1-year-long effort, but really happy that this effort is now culminating into a research conference that can be attended by all interested parties. So over to you, Fabrizio. And welcome, Vineet and Shashank.
Thank you so much, Misha. I'll begin by sharing my screen to let me know if there are any technical glitches. Otherwise, we can begin. So good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned by Misha, my name is Fabrizio Valenti, and I'm the head of the financial inclusion team at LEAD at Kriya University. Again, I want to, first of all, thank the whole Dvara team and all of the supporting stakeholders for organizing this conference and really supporting this initiative. It is both an honor and a pleasure to be here, even if virtually, given the current circumstances. So in the next 30 minutes, I'm going to present findings from a study on migrant household finance that I recently conducted with my colleagues Shashank Sridharan, and Vineet Kurian, of course, with the support of Dvara Research. So briefly, we will go through the study background, research question, and design before diving into descriptive findings and results from our regressions. And then, of course, we will conclude. I don't think that, given the introduction and given the audience, we need to spend much time in this forum to explain the social and economic significance of domestic migration in India. With this study, we specifically take a deep dive in migrant households finance and try to understand how financial decision-making unfolds across different types of migrant households. We will investigate who is the primary financial decision maker in the household across multiple types of choices and how this is influenced by different factors, both at the individual and household level. Finally, we will flip our analysis and see how migration and household characteristics, as well as the actual decision maker, affect financial decisions. So going into our research design, we obviously employ primary research. We adopt a mixed method design. We conducted qualitative interviews with a variety of sector experts, and many of them are here today actually, and financial institutions to inform and add context to our quantitative work. The quantitative work itself focuses on migrants from Bihar, Jharkhand, and Eastern UP. To recruit our sample, we partner with Grameen and leverage its IVR system and strong user base to send multiple IVR blasts to identify respondents. Respondents would receive this pre-recorded call, asked some screening questions, and practically gave their consent to opt into the survey. And with this helped us to create a pool of potential respondents from which we conducted a stratified random sampling and completed interviews for approximately 1,200 respondents from 600 different households. The innovation that really we introduced also through this methodology is that we conducted surveys with both migrants but also non-migrant members from migrant households. Meaning that at the end of the day, we have a total of 3 data sets: a migrant data set, a migrant households data set, and a matched data set. So let's take a look at our sample. So first of all, we observe that all of the migrants in our sample are male. This is due actually to our recruitment strategy. So this is very important to remember and keep in mind when interpreting results and recommendations. In terms of education, we see that nearly half of the sample has completed high school, quite interesting. Average household size is between 6 and 7 members, suggesting that other family members live with the migrant, his spouse and his children. Speaking of children, we see that the vast majority of households lives with children at around 1 or 2 per household. And in terms of caste, the vast majority of our sample is either OBC or from a scheduled caste. In terms of income, a couple of things of interest. First of all, we see that average household income every month is around 10,700 rupees in our sample. And in most cases, the primary source of household income are the remittances themselves submitted by the migrant, which further stresses really the importance of unpacking financial decision-making dynamics between the migrant and its household. Now, let's talk about the migrant. So first of all, we acknowledge that there is no universally acceptable or accepted definition of migrant or migration. In order, though, to make our results as comparable as possible, we choose to follow the most standard and accepted classifications and definitions. Specifically, we classify migrants along 3 dimensions that are duration, skills, and destination. Now, in terms of duration, we follow Census 2011 definitions and refer to migration to up to 6 months as temporary or seasonal and above 6 months as semi-permanent. In our sample, 57% of the respondents identified themselves as being temporary or seasonal migrants, while over a third as semi-permanent. So in terms of skills instead, we use ILO's International Standard Classification of Occupations to classify migrants according to their skills and abilities. Now, 80% of our sample falls under level 1, which is the lowest 1 out of 4, with most respondents reporting to be construction site workers and factory labor, which is consistent with existing literature on prevalent occupations in the study locations. And then finally, we broadly divide the destinations reported by respondents into 6 zones. And actually, we end up observing much more variation in destination than we anticipated, since we expected more migrants to have chosen Delhi as their destination. And interestingly, a fifth of our migrants are actually intrastate migrants rather than interstate migrants. We conclude our descriptive analysis looking at some key financial behaviors. First of all, we find that remittances are received by the migrant's father or spouse in over 70% of our sample. Now, very interestingly, we find that over 80% of our respondents use formal channels to submit remittances, bank-to-bank transfer being the most common of these channels. Now, this appears to be in contrast with a significant chunk of the literature on this sector, which reports informal channels as being the most popular one. Now, a plausible explanation for this discrepancy could be that much of this literature is actually a bit dated. And in the past 10 years, we have seen tremendous advances in financial inclusion in India, and migrants' preferences on how to submit remittances might have changed. Also, we see, it is interesting to note at this point, that bank account ownership is nearly universal in our sample, and that over 3/4 of migrants reported having a bank account at destination. Now, this reliance on formal channels is actually not observed in other financial behaviors. For instance, we noticed that 28% of migrants subscribe to an average of 3 loans in the past 18 months. However, only 3% of all respondents reported having borrowed from financial institutions, so formally. We observe a very similar pattern at source, where approximately 28% of households sign for an average of 2 loans, but only 70% of them from formal sources. So we observe a shift from informal to formal sources for remittances, which is not mirrored in credit, for example. Now, keep in mind, though, that this data was collected 9 months after the outbreak, the breakout, actually, of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is possible that this result might be caused by formal credit being harder to obtain in this period. In terms of savings, instead, we are not surprised to see that a relatively small share of migrants saves at destination as they remit most of their income. We are more surprised to see results from the household side, because comparing incomes, expenditures, and reported savings, we do think that there is a potential to increase saving habits among migrant households at source, perhaps through tailored financial services and products. Last but not least, before we move on, I want to stress that 70% of the sample reported having received some kind of government payments or social entitlement in the last 12 months. Now, moving on to our regression results. We'll see that we use a combination of different techniques. Simple, multinomial, and fractional logistical regressions are what we used. Beginning from the first one, we used a simple logic regression to understand what individual and household characteristics are correlated with a migrant being the primary decision maker over 7 different types of decisions. We conduct this analysis for 2 scenarios. First, when the migrant is at home, and then when the migrant is away. We conduct the same analysis for a different outcome variable as well. That is when the woman is the primary financial decision maker. You'll be able to find the results of the second set of regressions in our paper. We will not go over them in detail during today's presentation in the interest of time. Anyway, so let's go into these results. If you're reading the table on the left, please note that the first row presents odds ratios for the scenario when the migrant is at home, while the second row refers to the scenario when the migrant is away. Looking at trends and insights emerging across financial decisions and beginning with individual characteristics of the migrants, we notice that an increase in years since first migration results in an increase in the odds of the migrant being the decision maker across pretty much all decision types. With experience, migrants seem to acquire more influence on financial decisions, which is in line with literature that shows that migration increases financial awareness and sophistication, which really supports this sort of results. More experienced migrants have more influence on financial decisions. Duration of migration is not significant across most decisions, apart from two. Household savings, where when the migrant is away, the longer the migrant is away, the less likely it becomes to be the primary decision maker. And the second decision being expenses on education and health, where we observe the opposite. While this result is curious, it is confirmed across all of our regressions, which raises actually an interesting question for future research. Moving on, intuitively, we also observe that higher remittances are associated with a migrant being more likely to be in charge of large financial decisions, which is probably a result of higher contributions to overall household income, granting the migrant increased gains in decision-making power. Now, looking at household composition covariates, so moving on from individual covariates to collective covariates, we see that household size, as the household size increase, the odds of the migrant being the decision maker decrease. And this is intuitive, as more members may compete for a say in the decision-making process. The same reasoning holds true when there are more financial contributors in the household. Other household composition characteristics are important as well. As the number of children increases, the odds of the migrant being the decision maker increases across most categories. And this is likely because the migrant is generally the father of these children. On the other hand, the presence of an older male significantly and substantially decreases the migrant's decision-making power for most types of decisions. We see that it's almost 3 times less likely to be the decision maker across pretty much the board. Now, we are going to expand our analysis through a multinomial logic regression, and we are going to expand our analysis to all other household members. So this kind of regression is used to model cases where the dependent variable has more than 2 response categories. And in our situation, we have 5. That is, the migrant member himself, his spouse, the older male, the older female, and other household members, which are normally the migrant siblings. For the purposes of our analysis, we select migrants as the financial decision maker as the base category against which all others will be compared, which is, by the way, why we cannot simply drop the simple logic model from our study. And in terms of interpretation of results, all coefficients and odd ratios represent whether a household member, let's say, for example, the spouse, is more or less likely to be the decision maker compared relatively to the migrant. Now, to illustrate this with an example, you can take a look at the table at the bottom right of the slide. In this case, we see that the likelihood of an older male, for example, to be the primary decision maker on large financial expenditures compared to the migrant decreases as the number of years since the first migration go up. We see the same result for older female, other household members, and not for spouses. Hope that's clear. But before going into results, keep in mind that first, all results are for the migrants away scenario, as there was not enough variability in who's the primary decision maker in the migrants is at home scenario. Due to space constraints, very frankly, we can't present tables, which are very large, but we will focus on results and trends across financial decisions. And at 3, we will present our results starting from migration-related covariates, and then we will move on to household composition covariates. Now, what are our migration-related covariates? We should be already familiar with them. They are years since first migration, migrant skill level, size of the remittances, and duration of migration. So, first of all, we find that as years since first migration increase, all household members, except for the spouses, become less likely to be the decision maker compared to migrants across all financial decisions. In the analysis of the simple logic model, we argue that with increasing years since first migration, the migrant becomes more financially empowered, thus gaining more financial decision-making power, which is confirmed to an extent through this multinomial regression. However, what this regression adds is that we notice some sort of a couple or marital effect, for lack of a better definition, where a factor that increases the financial decision-making power of the migrant has a positive effect on his spouse as well. So it appears almost as if the migrant and the spouse tap into a sort of a shared pool of bargaining power. And we'll see that this result is mirrored to an extent in other covariates as well. Moving on to the next one, we see that results on skill do not really show any uniform trends, but they vary from a decision maker and type of choice. Overall, though, we see that higher skills seem to afford the migrant greater financial decision-making power, and we see that the significant results that we observe for the spouse category are in line with what we observed for previous covariates. Interestingly, we also observe that this variable is correlated with the migrant's siblings, more likely, becoming more likely to be the primary financial decision maker. In terms of size of remittances, results are very intuitive. We see that as the average size of remittances goes up, the migrant consistently becomes more likely to make all decisions, all financial decisions here, which is a result of holding more power and influence in the household. Now, migration, the duration of the migration yields some interesting results. Across categories, it appears that the migrant loses decision-making power in favor of the spouse, the older male and the older female. Results for other household members are not significant. This is particularly evident on savings decisions. As migrants spend longer periods of time away from home, they seem to tend to lose or maybe relinquish power on this specific decision. On the other hand, and if you remember the table and the observations that we put forward for the logic regression, we'll see that there is a confirmation of those results. We observe that migrants tend to maintain and actually increase decision-making power on health and education. And we hypothesize that maybe this is because these decisions are seen as important and valuable to the migrant, more important than other decisions. So they prefer to maintain control over them. But definitely, this result merits more careful investigation. Now, we move on to household composition covariates, which are size of households, presence of children, number of financial contributors, and presence of an older male. Starting from the top, we see that as household size increases, the migrant becomes less likely than all other household members, but the spouse, to make financial decisions. We argue that this is due to greater competition on decision-making power, which appears to put both the migrant and the spouse at a disadvantage. And you'll see that this mirrors the opposite of that marital effect that we mentioned earlier. These results are particularly positive and significant for older males and the other household member categories, which often normally includes the migrant's brother. So intuitively and coherently with the literature on the subject, gender seems to play an important role here, with male household members being at advantage when competition increases. Moving on, the effect of having a larger number of children in the household has the opposite effect. We observe that in this case, the spouse becomes more likely than the migrant to make all financial decisions except for emergency borrowing, while the opposite is true for all other household members across all decisions, pretty much. In our sample, most household members that are below 18 are actually the children of the migrant and of his spouse, which might explain why this variable is associated with the spouse, that is the mother, having more decision-making power. Third, as the number of financial contributors increases, the migrant becomes less likely to be the decision maker across all types of decisions and against all other household members, with the exception of, intuitively at this point, a spouse. We assume that the additional earning household members are often the migrant siblings, which would explain why we observe such high odds ratios under this category. That is the big winner, if you want, under this covariate are normally the other household members. Closing this part of the analysis, we see that the presence of an older male makes other household members less likely than the migrant to be the financial decision maker across pretty much all decisions. This effect is very pronounced, actually, and unsurprisingly, on the migrant spouse. This is not true, though, for one category of decision maker and for some types of choices. That is the older male's spouse, that is the older female in the house. And we argue that to an extent, this could be similar to that effect that we dubbed at this point, this marital effect that we observe for the migrant and his spouse. Okay, so this concludes the analysis of the multinomial regression, and the multinomial and the simple logic regression helped us understand what factors influence who's going to be the primary financial decision maker on a variety of choices. Now, with the next set of regressions, we flip the focus of our analysis from the decision maker to the decision. So in the next little while, we will look into two specific financial behaviors. That is, whether the household saves or not, and what share of its expenditures a household allocates on education and healthcare, which we'll model using a fractional logic model. So for both behaviors, we run two specifications of the model. The first specification looks at the category of the primary decision maker. At this point, we know who they are, the spouse, older male, and so on and so forth. And the second specification looks at the gender only of the primary decision maker. In addition to the earlier covariates on migrant and household characteristics with whom we are, I think, pretty familiar at this point, we now include covariates which try and capture the financial sophistication of the household, the degree of information asymmetry between the migrant and household members, and measures also to capture the risk preferences of the migrant. All right, let's begin with savings. So we see that in both specifications, the coefficient for average monthly household income is positive and significant. And this is consistent with literature globally, as well as fairly intuitive. Household composition characteristics, we see that they play also an important role in determining whether households save or not. First of all, household size has a negative effect on whether a household saves, as intuitively larger households are also associated with an increase in the number of dependents. On the other hand, the presence of more household members contributing to the overall income is correlated with higher savings. We observe some interesting gender trends in our results. In specification 2, for example, we see that when decisions on savings are made by women, the household is twice as likely to save. A result that is directionally confirmed by specification 1 as well. We also observe that the education level of the migrant is positively correlated with the likelihood of the household to save. But what really are the most interesting results of this analysis come at the bottom of the table on the left. That is that we observe that higher information asymmetry between the migrant and household members has a negative and significant effect on the likelihood of the household to save. Finally, we also find that households where decisions on savings are made in consultation with other members are more than twice as likely to save as compared to households where decisions are made by a single individual. Now, if we take these two results together, we can build actually a very strong and compelling argument about the importance of communication and sharing decision-making responsibilities to promote virtuous financial outcomes. When we look at spending on health and education, we see that some of these findings are actually confirmed, which is very encouraging for us. So we see, first of all, that in both specifications, average monthly household income has a large positive and significant effect on the proportion of household spending on education and healthcare. An interesting finding, however, here is that the number of financial contributors in the household is negatively correlated to spending in this category, which is maybe not intuitive, and we sorry about that. So we hypothesize that these additional earners end up not contributing much to the children's education, who would be their nieces and nephews, meaning that proportionally, a lower share of the household income ends up being spent on education. Now, the type and gender of the financial decision maker does not appear to be significantly correlated with expenditures on health and education. While on the other hand, we see that migrant education is and is possibly correlated with this expenditure across both model specification. Now, in addition to this, we find that migrants' risk preferences have a negative effect on the share of spending on education and healthcare. Being risk-prone is correlated in the literature. We've been less likely to save, and we assume that this might have a similar effect on expenditures on health and education. We also notice that using more sophisticated financial tools is negatively correlated with expenditures on health and education, which might also seem counterintuitive, but we posit that households that have access to more sophisticated financial tools, such as insurance, are less likely to incur into out-of-pocket expenses related to health and education. And now, finally, and consistently with the findings on savings decisions, consultation among household members is found to be highly positive and significantly correlated with the share of expenditure on healthcare and education. Now, moving on to our last slide, and thank you for staying with me on this. We're going to conclude and present some recommendations. So I realized that we went through a lot of material this afternoon, and in terms of key takeaways, our study demonstrates that both individual and migrant and collective household characteristics in migrant households determine financial decisions and financial decision processes taken by migrant households, which is an essential result for both financial institutions as well as governments and NGOs working in the financial inclusion space, as it shows that financial products and interventions need to take into account both of these sets of characteristics in order to be effective. Interestingly, we find that communication and trust among household members are positively correlated with virtuous financial behaviors, which supports the argument in favor of product design, for example, joint accounts, and interventions aimed at increasing and facilitating these kind of outcomes. Findings from our qualitative interviews provide actionable recommendations building upon this evidence. We began our analysis noting that the transition from informal to formal finance among migrants has progressed from for remittances and bank account ownership, but not for much else. We argue, however, that this can be used as a springboard to promote the adoption of more complex financial products among migrant households. And the first strategy to achieve this objective could be assisted offerings through, for example, agent-based models. There is a growing literature showing the effectiveness of these models to promote the adoption of novel financial products and plug last-mile delivery gaps. This, of course, though, hinges on agents being trained to serve migrants and their households and having access to products tailored to their needs. But what could these products be? Well, such novel financial offerings could be goal-based financial instruments such as savings, short-term insurance products, or credit to finance migration or rental housing, for example. In a similar vein, product bundling can also prove to be an effective strategy. For example, bundling advanced products like insurance with simpler ones, such as credit or savings, that can help households shield themselves against income shocks. we argue that the willingness to adopt such products could increase following the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic. That was a significant shock. So overall, we hope that the insights emerging from our work will spur interest and will prove to be valuable among both practitioners and researchers to find better ways to serve the financial needs of migrant households. And thank you for your time and your attention. Please do not hesitate to contact us with any questions, concerns, and comments at these addresses. And I look forward to the next presentation, the Q&A session, and the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio. Bang on time, actually. You stick to the half an hour limit very well. So thank you so much for that. We'll swiftly move to the second presentation of the day. And I would now like to invite Gaurav Sinha from Grameen Foundation to share their research presentation. Just a quick reminder for everybody that the conference is being live streamed on the conference website. So we do not have the audience here on the Zoom link with us, but we are tracking all the questions that are coming in. And after the presentation by Grameen Foundation and after Timothy's remarks, we will open it up for Q&A. So kindly bear with us. And over to you, Gaurav.
Thanks so much, Misha. This is Rahul for your kind introduction to the Grameen team. And I am joined by my colleagues Gaurav Sinha and Achal Agrawal, who have worked on this project. So, yep.
Welcome, Rahul. Sorry about that. Welcome.
No worries. Thanks. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for having us here today. We at Grameen Foundation are really excited to share the results of our study at this household research conference. And before I begin, we'd like to share our deep gratitude to the Research Foundation for all of their support and encouragement in successfully completing this study. This has been really a learning experience for all of us. As you would see, our research is titled Understanding the Impact of COVID-19 on Preferences for Household Portfolio, Social Security and Risk Mitigation Strategies for Low-Income Migrant Households and Their Response to Unconditional Cash Transfers. And it aims to decipher the household portfolio of the low-income migrant household. I'll talk
Rahul, we can't hear you. Yeah, I think it's better now.
Is it better?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yeah.
Already here.
Rahul, it keeps going on mute. I'm not sure why that happens. And it's...
Let me try to mute and unmute myself. Is it better now?
We can hear you now. We can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. So what I was just trying to explain is to just set the context of the study here. As Bihar accounts for 15% of the out-migration in India and is one of the most active migrant corridors in the country. And this research study was conducted in Nevada district of Bihar, which was identified as one of the bottom 20 aspirational districts by Niti Aayog in 2019 and is home to thousands of migrant workers in India. Yeah. So this is roughly the flow of the presentation that we have here. We'll begin with just sharing the context and need of such a study and then briefly appraise you about Grameen's unconditional cash transfer program, as this was a program which outreach was leveraged to recruit respondents for this study. And moving on, we'll be discussing the research methodology, and this will include sharing details about the research design, sampling plan, definitions, timeline, and overall research scope. And then we'll move on to the segment for the research findings. And finally, we'll encapsulate our learning towards the end to conclude our presentation. And after that, we can have a Q&A. Yeah. So just to set the context, ILO estimated that about 400 million workers in the informal economy were at the risk of falling back into the poverty, and consequent negative coping mechanism would result in deepening of poverty in its ILO 4 monitor that it comes out regularly. And the COVID pandemic, the wave 1, and the subsequent lockdown was not challenging for all. However, I think the migrants had it worst, with sudden loss of jobs while being marooned away from home with little or no support, and restrictions on travel to go back to their homes, I think added to their misery. And as India continued to grapple with COVID-19 induced migrant crisis, the need to have better social security and risk mitigation strategies for these household incomes was apparent more than ever. The pandemic had brought upon immense financial and psychological stress on these households, and it was expected to drive changes in the household portfolio, financial decision making, and behaviors of these migrant households. So all of these culminated into conceptualization of this research study, which aimed at improving the understanding of household portfolio of a migrant household, along with decrypting their risk mitigation strategies, coping mechanisms to tide over socioeconomic vulnerabilities, and pandemic situations such as these. So that's the context and need. Why do we thought that this is a very crucial study? Yeah. So just to set the context about the Grameen's unconditional cash transfer program. So Grameen responded to the unprecedented crisis of COVID-19 by extending unconditional cash transfer program to the most vulnerable households in Bihar and Maharashtra through its Give Without Border program, wherein the identification of the most vulnerable people to receive assistance was done using a mix of technology and human intelligence, which included participatory wealth ranking and using a vulnerability index to identify the most vulnerable. These unconditional cash transfers allowed these poor households the choice and flexibility to allocate resources to meet their needs as per the choices, and consider them the best judge for prioritization of the need. And also, one needs to be considerate of the fact that many of the households who face the immediate vulnerabilities due to sudden loss of jobs, socioeconomic factors, and other exclusionary measures, but were not targeted under many of the government programs because they didn't fit into the set criteria. And Grameen's Give Without Borders program tried to plug this inequity. So overall, this program provided unconditional cash transfer to more than 1,400 families in Bihar and Maharashtra. Yeah. So if you want to learn more about the program, please visit our website. Yeah. So this is about the research methodology part, and maybe I will try to spend a minute or two here just to understand the overall the research design, which was a mixed method research design, wherein we used 5 lines of evidences throughout the study. The study kick-started with an in-depth desk review to finalize the definitions, research methodologies, and research questions. And then the quantitative research method included a cross-sectional household survey with the migrant household. And the qualitative research method included 6 focus group discussions with the migrant households, 4 key informant.
Rahul, we can't hear you again, unfortunately. And it's back now.
I'm not sure.
We can hear you now, but some technical issues, I suppose.
Okay. Okay, then I'll now continue.
Yeah.
Sure. So the qualitative research method that I was talking about included focus group discussions, key informant interviews, and a participatory research exercise for mapping the family finance of the migrant household. So these were the 5 lines of evidences that we used under this mixed method research design study. And for the quantitative survey, a multi-stage random sampling methodology was adopted, and a total of 428 households were interviewed for the quantitative rate. And a key distinction here is to understand that 50% of these households were the households who had received benefits under the Grameen's unconditional cash transfer. So a sum of 4,500 in one tranche was disbursed to these households for mitigating the crisis of COVID-19, and the balance 50%, that is 211 households, were from the pool who did not receive the unconditional cash transfers, but were a migrant household. So I'll not dive deep into the sampling methodologies. Maybe if there are any Q&A, then I can talk about it more. So moving on to the definitions and timeline. So migrant, as part of the study, we identified that anyone who stays away from home for at least 6 months or more between April 2019 to March 2020 is considered a migrant, and the household, the native household, is considered as a migrant household. So, and any household with one or more such members was considered as a migrant household. You'd throughout the study, you would come across pre-COVID, post-COVID. I know means this is not maybe the best terminology, but pre-COVID is something which is before 22nd of March 2020, when Prime Minister announced the Janta curfew, and the post-COVID period is time after 22nd of March 2020. So that's the distinction and definition. So yeah. So this is overall the research scope, and the research aims to present a snapshot of the household portfolio of a low-income migrant household, understand their savings and investment strategy, financial behavior, and level of participation women have in the financial decision-making amongst the low-income migrant households. Furthermore, it aims to establish the effect of COVID-19 on their household portfolio and their priorities. And beside this, it also explores the response of the participating households towards unconditional cash transfers. As you would have seen while in the sampling, we had 50% of this household having received an unconditional cash transfer. So to answer these, there were three key hypotheses that we were testing in this research. First was that COVID-19 induced shocks have affected the household portfolio priorities and will be driving change in the household portfolio in near future of a migrant household. COVID-19 would change the savings and investment pattern of a low-income migrant household. And the third one was that risk event amplified by COVID-19 will encourage more people to adopt risk mitigating strategies as a need for social security emerges. So these were the three key research hypotheses that we have tested during this study. So now I would move to the research research findings and observation section, wherein we will talk about the key research findings that we have established. Yeah. So before we get into start discussing key findings around our hypothesis, let's just try to encapsulate the household profile of the survey respondents. So as stated in the definition slide, that all of these households had at least one migrant worker. More than 3/4 of the households had member working outside Bihar, while 1/4 of the household had interstate migrant. That means
Rahul, we can't hear you again. It seems fine now. I think there's just some switch on and off that keeps happening. Okay. No,
we lost you again, Rahul.
Gaurav, do you perhaps want to take over, or how should we do this?
Rahul, in case you can take over the presentation, or you can. You are audible again. Yeah, you are audible.
Okay,
again.
okay. I have just connected to a new network. Let's see if it works fine. I'm sorry about this.
No worries.
Okay, so we were discussing the key demographic findings of the profile of the household and the migrants. And I was mentioning that that about 1/4 of the household had intra-state migrant. That means that these households had member working within Bihar but outside Nevada district. And in terms of a preferred migrant corridor, and Bangalore seemed to be a preferred migrant destination migrant corridor for these households. Yeah, and 4 out of 5 households relied on a single adult earning member. And that highlights the dependency on the migrant's income for these households. As you would see in subsequent slides, that the contribution to household income. So, but this is a very key finding. And as you would see that about 92% of these households belong to marginalized communities, and 3/4 of the total sample was identified by government as a below poverty line household. So those are some of the key data points we need to keep in mind while we discuss the demographic profile. Another key data point that we should also be considerate of that if you go by the secondary statistics, the average household size of Bihar is 5.4. However, in the current study, we found it at 7. And this is one of the plausible reflections of the permanent migrants returning to their native places during post-lockdown scenario. So yeah, this is about the profile part. Maybe we can. Yeah. So maybe let's start to look at the household portfolio, and then for moving for the next few slides, really focusing on the household portfolio of these low-income migrant households, and then how COVID-19 has impacted them. In this slide, we present income and expense aspect of the household portfolio. On the left-hand side of it, the household portfolio lists the pre-COVID era observation, wherein you could see that what was the earning of the household pre-COVID, and towards the right-hand side of the slide, you would see what's the impact of the COVID and how the present status is post-COVID. So, starting with the income, as you would see, the mean, the average monthly income of these migrant households were close to 19,000 Indian currency, and a migrant household contributed about 47% to the total total monthly income of this household. And so most of these migrant households were no private sector employees with their household members who were sitting in Nevada, practicing agriculture and allied activities. And post the lockdown, when migrant members started losing their informal sector jobs and returned back home, and the impact is not reflected into the post-COVID monthly income, which saw a dip by 42% and was the mean monthly income was at near to 11,000 Indian INR. So, and another aspect, the other notable change that you would see is the percentage increase in participation in agriculture and allied activities, and it has gone from 13% to 18%. Moving on to the expense side, the mean monthly expense prior to COVID was close to 4,000 rupees, which was about 21% of the total monthly income. And nearly 50% of this was spent on by a household on food and grocery related expenses. And if you see the impact of COVID on it, the mean monthly expense has gone up to 6,700, and while the income has come down and the consumption as a proportion has gone up. So it is close to 60% of the total income, total income of the household. And food and groceries continue to be one of the biggest expense for these households. So there is some, while we were doing the qualitative interviews, one of the common reflections of these respondents was that they had cut down on their consumption, although the quantitative results say a different story. And one of the plausible explanations for this contradiction we could think of is that people reported cutting down on expenses such as traveling or food consumptions such as milk, fruits, vegetables, while the increase in expense could be due to the increased consumption as family members returned back home. We could also find some evidence around this in the secondary literature also. And also, one should take a note that the consumption as a proportion of income experienced a significant jump, impacting the household's ability to save and invest post-COVID. And as you would see in subsequent slide, how those have been affected or changed. Yeah. So on this slide, for the household portfolio, we discuss about assets and liability. As you would see, we discussed. And we have used 72nd round of NSSO conducted between 14-15 to assign values to various low values asset articles. And an average participant household possessed asset worth of 25,261, adjusting for average inflation rate of 4.27 between 2015, that is NSSO's round 72, and 2021. Land, house, and gold will explode in binary terms of ownership as the values are time volatile. Also, all landholders were small farm landholders as they owned less than 2 hectares of land. The findings are in line with literature which suggests that wealth in Indian households is locked away in physical assets such as land, house, gold, while financial assets remain underinvested. Couple of points that impact of COVID you can see here is distress selling and decrease in savings. About 1/3 of the households reported distress selling, and most of these households sold grains and livestock for coping with the financial stress they were in. The financial stress on these migrants can be further highlighted with the fact that 68% of these households reported decrease in savings. Now, coming to the liabilities as an impact of COVID, there was statistically a significant rise in number of households relying on credit, while borrowing experienced an overall statistically significant increase.
Rahul, we lost you again.
Loans between formal and informal sources. Though if you see in absolute terms, the dependence on informal sources of credits increased post-COVID. Yeah. So just to summarize the 2 slides on the household portfolio, the key takeaways we have from here is that there has been a decrease in income, which is close to in tune of 42%. Households reportedly cut down their per capita cost on consumption, but overall there was an observed rise in household expenses. Financial assets were underinvested, and most of the assets were locked in high value assets such as land, gold, house, and dependence on credit sources have increased post lockdown, and the results were statistically significant. Yeah, so I'll just spend a minute because this is one of the qualitative research methods that we used, of which I talked about during the methodology section. This is the household portfolio snapshot, and this is something which we developed using a participatory research methodology called mapping family finance. And so this is a story of Ramasis with whose wife and younger son, our research team has conducted this exercise. And as you would see, the highlighted parts are the one wherein they have either saved, they have an asset, or they are using, for example, say small petty business, they sell vegetables for that. So, and they have identified their long-term goals, their debt. So this represents the complete portfolio of the household, and this is a tool which helps us really better understand the household portfolio through qualitative research method. So yeah. Now moving on to the financial behavior aspect. I think the study, another part of the study, we also tried to assess the prevalent financial attitude and behavior of these households. And some of the key insights that were that the low instances of budgeting for monthly expenses and prioritization of consumption over savings and investment. It highlighted the opportunities for improved financial behavior of these households. As you'd see the numbers here, that only 8% of the households prepared a monthly budget, and again, only 49% of these households had never thought about any retirement plan. Again, another 28% were relying on their children to support the retirement, and only 23% of these households were saving or generating assets to support their retirement. One thing that was very crucial here is that the pre-COVID uptake of social protection products were very poor, with only 4% of the households investing in either a pension, insurance, or a PPF. Retirement plan for these households was not on the top agenda, as I explained just now, and the importance of social security products were largely appreciated post-COVID. So this is again an important finding, but it didn't translate into intention to invest. Young and women respondents showed no greater affinity to invest in pension schemes compared to older folks and men respectively. And the family size seemed to strengthen intention to invest, while families experiencing financial income variation within a year valued investment in insurance lesser. So these were a couple of the findings that were from our regression results, and I think very important findings. So moving on to the next slide, this slide reflects the savings, investment, and risk mitigation strategies of the low-income migrant households of Nevada. And as you would see, uptake of formal financial products and services for savings was moderate, with about 39% of people still saving at home. Ease of access to fund was a key guiding factor for choosing the savings destination, as they shared with us during the qualitative interviews. And with the lockdown, migrant households increasingly chose to save at SHG and post offices, as the research results suggest. And savings was the only reliable source to build any degree of financial resilience for these households. The savings amount as percentage of total income was lower on the side, and quite understandably due to consumption needs, specifically during the pandemic times. And other asset classes were marginally used, which no kind of limits our study's ability to statistically comment on changes post-COVID. And a couple of points from the
Rahul,
Yep.
just to let you know that you have 5 more minutes.
Sure. Yeah. So again, the attitude of spending then savings is reflected in the savings behavior of the respondent, as you would see in the results from the study. Yeah. So to summarize again to these two slides, as we observed, the participants showed no financial behavior inclined towards consumption rather than savings or investment. And given only a few prepared monthly budgets and the sunken cash inflows, most families seem to be ill prepared for any emergencies such as these. Yeah. So this slide specifically talks about the women participation and bargaining power within these migrants household. And as you would see, that women participation in the workforce was very poor, with only 1 out of 10 households having a gainfully employed women. About 1/3 of the households had a women as a key decision maker, but their participation in financial decision making was low. Only 16% of the households had women who were consulted or took an independent financial decision in the past 12 months. Again, close to 13% of these women were accessing credit before COVID, which saw a reduction by 2% post-COVID. But I think this another aspect, though, that highlighted increased vulnerability of the households where women were key decision maker, was the greater likelihood of having a reduction in savings post-COVID. So despite some disheartening results on women economic empowerment, there are a few bright spots which I would like to specifically highlight here. So women, the regression, and these are from our regression results, women were more likely to invest in social security products such as pension and insurance against men. Households where women held key decision-making power in the past 12 months were more likely to be financially resilient, and this is demonstrated by their belief of arranging emergency fund. Yeah, so these are two bright spots that we could identify. So finally, towards the closer, this is their response to the unconditional cash transfer. The support measured up to the 44% of the average monthly income during.
Rahul, we seem to have lost you again. Could be an issue with the headset. I'm not sure. Could you just do a sound check?
Hello.
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
So the UCT households reported that they would have turned to borrowing from informal sources to support their need if this aid was not extended. About 68% of these households would have taken a loan from informal sources if they would not have received unconditional cash transfer. And as you would see in the utilization aspect, most of the utilization was for immediate needs, consumption purposes. Only a part of the fund was used for savings or any other purposes. And if you look at the fund uses, the 50% of these fund uses were decided by the male folks, and a balance where 33% of the households where women decided the fund uses, while at the 17% of the household it was decided jointly. So again, this UCT grant, small, it allowed people the flexibility to identify and address the needs that impacted the most. Yeah, so maybe. Yeah, so to come to the conclusion, I think there are a few of the conclusions that we could clearly establish is that there has been a severe impact on the household portfolio of migrant households with decrease in income, distress selling, dip in savings, increase in expenses, and increased reliability on informal sources of credit. I think ease of access is what is driving a better uptake of SHGs or self-help group. As you'd see, the client education was not up to the mark, and it needs probably a concerted effort for these migrant households to better manage their financial behavior and attitude. And largely for these households, women had very low bargaining power and had low participation in the financial decision making. One of the important aspects that also come through the results is where women were more likely to adopt financial products for risk mitigation and social security. So that's really gives us an insight on a way forward. And lastly, the UCT served as a reliable measure for consumption purposes. So yeah, these are the few way forward. I think we
Rahul, we've lost you again. Sorry.
I'm so sorry about this.
We can hear you now.
So the way forward that we think is the diversification of income and asset. As you would see, most of these households had a single earning member and mostly relied on their earnings. And also the assets were largely into which had no poor liquidity, such as land, house, gold, which can be further diversified. Another aspect is the client education, with I think as we saw that specifically education around social security products and risk mitigation was low. Also the financial behavior, wherein we saw poor budgeting and a lower take-off foreign financial product. So this is an area which is to be targeted. And finally, as Fabrizio also rightly mentioned in his that there has to be no savings plus product or goal-based saving, which is kind of tailor-made for the vulnerabilities and of these households, and kind of create a social security need for the low-income migrant household. And probably, as the research suggested, that how do we kind of make it gender transformative by increasing women, including women, and probably with a business correspondent network, which kind of extend it at their doorstep. So yeah, these are the few way forward. Yeah. So that brings me to the conclusion of the study section. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rahul, and apologies for rushing you through the slides, but we will take the questions from the audience in a couple of minutes. I'd now like to actually move to the next part of the agenda and would like to invite Timothy Ogden for his remarks and reflections on the research being presented so far. Timothy Ogden is Managing Director of Financial Access Initiative, a research center housed at New York University, focused on how financial services can better meet the needs and improve the lives of low-income households. He's also a senior fellow of Aspen Institute's Economic Opportunities Program. He was also managing director of the US Financial Diaries Project, a joint initiative between NYU and CFSI, which tracked the financial lives of 235 US households for a full year. Tim writes and speaks frequently on topics of financial inclusion and financial services innovation. And we're very delighted to have you with us today, Tim. Thank you so much for such an early morning slot. Apologies, but over to you for your remarks.
Thank you, Misha, and good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the invitation to speak on these very useful and interesting pieces of work that Dvara has brought together here. I'm going to keep my comment short and limit the questions, because I could see from some of the chat that we do have a lot of questions coming, and I think there's some great questions. But I do want to provide some thoughts on the framing overall of how we think about these questions and the contributions overall of these studies, and helping us understand what's really happening at a household level. So, specifically, I appreciate very much the efforts that these studies have done in thinking about household finance from the perspective of the households themselves, and especially from the perspectives of migrant households. I think it really is important to call out that these studies view the migrants as a unitary part of a household. And that is a quite unusual thing in relation to what we have historically approached the question of migration, where the idea is that as soon as a migrant leaves the household, they become a fully separate economic unit. And that distorts how we think about both the decision to migrate and the long-term effects of migration. So as Michael Clemens and I have argued, migration for low-income households is an investment strategy just like any other investment strategy that a household could make. And we are impoverished in our understanding ourselves when we don't treat migration as an investment, and therefore view what happens after migration as a return on the investment. And if we start from the perspective of seeing that migration is driven by the fact that migration is the highest return on, or the highest investment opportunity, the investment opportunity with the highest possible return, and that households are making fully rational decisions in doing a great deal of work to enable migration in the first place, then and then the ongoing returns from that investment. And so our thinking about household finance in migrant households should start from this more, shall we say, traditional economic view of these households as more fully rational agents, evaluating a wide variety of options and possibilities for their household finances and making choices about the best way to deploy their resources to seize those opportunities and to protect themselves from a variety of risks, and follow on from those to further investment. So remittances specifically, the literature has unfortunately been impoverished by this view as remittances as some sort of windfall or gift rather than income or return on investment. And what is wonderful about both of these efforts is that it doesn't treat them that way. It treats remittances and the migration decision closer to this investment and the return on investment. And that helps us, I think, really better understand the decision making in these households, and therefore enables us to make better policy choices and product development decisions based on that. So the more that we can use data like this, create data like this in these studies, and view households as closer to rationally informed agents who are, in fact, making, with an assumption of making the best decisions available to them in the moments that they have, the better we are able to, I think through what the possibilities are and where the opportunities are to assist those households. So, from there, I want to sort of call to mind a famous dictum from the marketing literature in understanding what people want. So we have to, if we are going to take this data and apply this data usefully, we need to do it through a lens of what the households want. And still across the board in household finance research, I find we put too much emphasis on products as opposed to goals, and look at a household's use of a particular product as indicative too much of whether they are doing the right thing, as opposed to saying the product may in fact not be the problem. Lack of use of a product is not the fault of the household, but the fault of the product. So there's this famous dictum from the marketing literature that no one wants a 1/4-inch drill bit, they want a 1/4-inch hole. Translated somewhat differently, one might say that no one wants a roof, they want protection from the elements. The thing in itself is not the goal, it is the outcome of having that thing that is in fact what we need to do. And so if we're going to understand the household, then we need to start from what is it the household is trying to accomplish. So based on work that we've done over a number of years and many others have done, from financial diaries to many other studies of household finance, there is a rubric for thinking, I think, of what households are trying to do in order. That I think of as the first goal of the household is to manage consumption or manage liquidity. Only when households can manage consumption do they move on to another key goal, which is to manage investment. If any household that is so poor that they cannot manage consumption sufficiently is not going to be able to take that next step and manage investment. When they can manage investment as well, then they begin to think about managing risk. And when we look at the set of household decisions, I think it is useful to look at the data that has been presented in these studies to see these challenges of households accomplishing these goals of managing liquidity or consumption, and then managing investment, and then managing risk. And we see that, for instance, in the study just being discussed, is that the households do recognize the need to manage risk, to invest in resiliency, even if they're not doing it. And I don't think we then conceive of that as we need to educate the households to take additional steps to manage risk, as much as the households are not fully able to manage liquidity and manage investment, and therefore they are not going to prioritize managing risk until we help them meet those primary needs. That lens also, I think, helps us understand the first study in terms of decision-making within migrant households, as these households are trying to, across a very difficult set of circumstances, manage liquidity, manage consumption, and manage investment. And who is, as Fabricio was saying, the problems of information asymmetry, and who is better able to make decisions about liquidity and investment, given the geographic separation of households. And I, tend to think of, that split of decision making having primarily to do with the visibility of what is the optimal choice. So, I've argued just a minute ago that remittance should be considered a form of income. But for all income earners, there is household bargaining. I'm sure in every one of our households, there is bargaining between income earners about what is the best way to use the income. And that migrants, as they are further separated from the household, tend to focus their decision-making on things that are easy for them to understand and see from a distance. So, with that, though, we can layer on, I think, another step. And I'm sure you'll hear more about this from my colleague, Jonathan Morduck shortly, is, then when we think about the tools that households need to manage liquidity and manage investment, we can conceive of that as the challenge of turning flows into lumps and turning lumps into flows. And that is the role of a financial product. It is a very difficult thing to do, particularly in areas where there is a lack of formality, is that households need tools that allow them to turn a flow, regular or irregular, especially irregular flow, into a lump so that they can invest. And then they need additional tools, so once they make that investment, to turn it into flows that meet the consumption needs in the right way at the right time. And so then as we again look both at household decision-making and the use of products, we can think through in what ways are households able or not able to turn irregular and unexpected and surprising flows into lumps, and what tools and products are they able to use that enable them to turn the lumps of investment that they have made into flows that meet their consumption needs. So I would close then with just one reflection on going forward from here. Building off of a comment that Rahul made towards the end of his presentation of there is an element absolutely of helping households see products that they are unfamiliar with and how those products can help them meet those goals. But I think just as importantly, when we think about, say, correspondent or agent-based networks as a tool for educating the households, just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, is a tool for financial services providers to be educated themselves on what products are needed, rather than educating the client on what products they should be using, but educating us on what products we need to develop that effectively address those challenges of turning flows in liquidity into investment and turning investments into flows. And with that, Misha, I'll turn it over to the many excellent questions we have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim. I really like that last point you made about financial literacy for the financial service providers themselves. We never hear about that. So I think that's a really strong takeaway from your remarks. So we have a set of questions, actually. I'll walk the panelists through that question. But one question for you, Tim, because we have one question coming from the audience, which is any particular limitation that you would like to cite from the research that has been presented today? Any particular remarks on the research methodology, on the takeaways, on the policy recommendations?
Particular limitations.
Yes.
So I would say, that there has overall not been enough across the board, not just as a limitation of these studies, a limitation in the very close inspection over time of households' financial decision-making, which, I think what we need to do with studies like this is understand in terms of policy implications, not so much focusing on the limitations of the studies, but focusing on the overall limitation in our knowledge, building on what you're just saying, Misha, on our own financial literacy, is that we are still relatively new in seeing data like this. And so I think we need to be very humble about interpreting it, because another conversation I was having recently with a researcher looking at very high frequency data and thinking we were going to then be able to make clear policy recommendations from it. And this data that gets us into this level of detail is, we are at a stage in research where we are going from grainy black and white pictures of household finance to 4K MRI sonogram internal details, and thinking that we are immediately going to understand the relationship between those details. Suddenly, I guess another way of saying it is we're going from a distant picture to an internal view of the body, and thinking that we can very immediately and easily make the connection between that internal picture of the household to external outcomes. And we just don't have enough data or experience yet in making those connections. And so I think here the limitation is less about methodology per se, as I think we still need to be very, very humble as we look at these data to think about highly prescriptive policies, because we still have a long way to go in understanding how these, the decision-making authorities and how they change in contexts that have a lot more to do with a variety of factors than just finance, and how that plays out into financial decision-making. And also, household resilience to incredibly challenging circumstances with the pandemic, and how that changes their decision-making. So I wouldn't point out any specific limitations to the studies themselves, but this issue of how we carefully sort of use these as building blocks in our overall set of knowledge in developing policies.
Yeah, sure. Sure, Tim, that's helpful. So I'll just, pose a couple of questions now. Firstly, for the team at lead at Kriya University. So specifically to you, Fabrizio. One question that was unanswered is from Prabir. Do we have information about the agency over other financial and non-financial assets of the respondents? I think that is one theme that we didn't talk about in detail. So would you like to quickly answer that?
Yeah, sure. So from in our study, in our sample itself, we have information about asset ownership, but I don't think that it would be fair to say that gives information about agency on the asset itself. We did not directly capture information in our sample.
Okay. Another quick question for the lead team. Could you explain briefly the analytical process to arrive at the product ideas on your last slide? I think this is something that even Tim spoke about just now, which is that just the fact that we have data is itself a huge step, and we need to be cautious before making recommendations along product design. But your quick response to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And also in terms of limitations of this study, really like any study that is coming out that has been whose data has been collected in 2020, 2021, is that they are heavily influenced by contextual factors that are the COVID pandemic, and definitely influence the financial behaviors and the dynamics at the household level as well. But going to the specific question, I should have probably made it more clear in the presentation, but the recommendations themselves came from the qualitative interviews that we've had with financial institutions, sector experts, academics, and a number of senior actors. We do have in our presentation in the appendix a list of people that we spoke with. But anyway, through this conversation, these insights came up, and we just limited ourselves to collecting them and linking them to the data that emerged from the quantitative survey.
Right. And if I can also request Rahul and Gaurav to take a couple of questions that have come for their presentation. So one question we have for the Grameen team is, how do you justify the income categorization for the migrants? They have not elaborated further on this, but would you like to respond to that?
Nisha, can you ask the participant to highlight what do they mean by income categorization actually?
Right. I think it is to do with like how have you, what is the sort of inclusion criteria for selecting the respondents in your study?
Okay.
What is the income, average incomes that they earn? So that I think it's difficult for us to go back to the audience,
Yeah.
but I think that's what they mean.
Okay. So regarding that particular question, actually, this project, this research project kind of leveraged the outreach of one of our existing programs. So there we were assessing vulnerability due to COVID. So these people might not be the people living at the bottom of the pyramid, but at that particular point, just after COVID, they were the most affected. So these people were reached out and financial assistance was extended to them. So these kind of formed the part of our intervention group. And obviously the sample size was not enough. So we had to pull in other set of people who were like similar on some of the aspects. We tried to have uniform participants in terms of caste, in terms of land ownership, and the migrant status as well. So that's
Right. Thanks, Gaurav. Another question for you actually on the coping strategies. So there's a question which says by Guru Kopa, even though there was increased demand for agricultural works in the villages, wages offered were lower compared to normal times. Could you talk a little bit about the different coping strategies used by low-income households post-COVID without the unconditional cash transfer? I think this is something that Rahul also spoke a little bit about, the impact of unconditional cash transfer, saying that had the cash transfers not been given, borrowing would have increased. But could you elaborate on that point and other coping strategies?
okay. Rahul, do you want to take it? Yeah.
Sure. So, few of the coping mechanisms that we could establish during our study.
Rahul, there's background noise coming. Yeah.
Hello, is it better now?
There's some static noise.
Hello, is it better now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So, couple of things as part of our study, we also try to identify specifically in terms of coping mechanisms that most of these households had cut down on their expenses, and those were mostly in terms of expenses related to their expenses on food, also in terms of traveling, also, and also as in they were in a situation where they also had to many times incur health related expenses. So and many of these specific expenses were cut down. That's one of the coping mechanisms. The another coping mechanisms that we highlighted was distress selling. I think about 1/3 of the households reported distress selling, and these distress selling were mostly of grains that they used to keep for future consumptions, or say livestock also in many cases we come across. So this was second, and obviously the third was their tendency, borrowing specifically for through informal financial, so informal sources. So that also increased a lot, as you would see in the study. So these were few of the coping mechanisms that were there.
Right.
Rahul, if I may add to that, actually, so the per capita consumption actually came down, but cause number of people had actually after reverse migrated to the native places, so the cost actually went up. The financial assets and usually people would use, it was largely underinvested, so there we didn't see much change actually. And the last bit that Rahul was talking, that reliance on credit actually increased. And even though in absolute terms, we did see movement from formal to informal, but our study didn't show statistically significant differences post and pre-COVID.
Yeah. Thanks, Gaurav. We have one comment from Dr. Sai Kumar. It's a comment and not necessarily a question, but would be interesting to get both your and Fabrizio and Shashank and Vineet's inputs on this. So Dr. Sai Kumar says that I have observed an interesting phenomena in managing household finance. In India, though, low-income households have very little amount to manage, but if that little amount is with the control of the woman of the household, then that probably leads to optimum distribution for the welfare of family. Would you agree with this statement? And I see some similar themes emerging from both your research pieces. So starting with you, Rahul, and then we can move to Fabrizio.
Maybe we lost him, so maybe I can take that question.
Yeah.
Misha, we actually did see that whenever a woman was involved in the decision making, at least the intention were in the positive direction. But in terms of practice, like in our study, we observed that whenever the women was involved in the decision making, they actually saw a reduction post-COVID in terms of savings. So there was positive intent, but it wasn't translating. And again, these are different times. So we have to be very considerate of that fact. Yeah.
Okay. Fabrizio, would you like to add to that theme? Because even in your research presentation, you were talking about how the women's role increases when the migrant is away.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. That emerged. We do have a bunch of other regression results that we did not display in the presentation that also lend to that. But really, that part of the analysis focus on understanding when the woman became, the primary decision maker across different types of choices. To the point of the commenter, the last part of the analysis is probably the most relevant one, where we see, okay, if we classify, and this is a bit of a step that we need to make, that seeing households having households save or spend more money or a greater share of their household income in health or education is a virtuous financial behavior we would like to see more of. We see that at least in the first case, the savings bit, having the woman as the primary decision maker for that specific decision has a positive effect on household savings. So in that regard, absolutely, that is something that matches what the commenter was mentioning.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Fabrizio. And Tim, if I may bring you in for this question, if that's okay. And we have just a minute or so left. So, your concluding thoughts on this theme, Tim, which is that, several research studies and even the one presented today showed that when the financial decision making authorities with the women, they spend towards education or healthcare, and they are more vocal about savings, etc. I want to ask a slightly controversial question. How should we interpret this finding? Should this be interpreted as that all the financial services should be directed solely to women, or how should we interpret this about access to finance for men and the equitable distribution of that?
Thank you, Misha, for leaving me with the most controversial question as we think about gender essentialism. Yeah, I will say in this regard, we recently had a hour-long conversation about understanding gender profit gaps, which I do think relates here. And there are a number of researchers doing very, very important research on understanding that. The way I think about this is, again, back through this lens that I talked about is, if households are trying to manage liquidity and manage investment and manage risk, and then thinking about through this from the woman's perspective, as the studies have pointed out, there are relatively few women who are able to earn enough to supply their families. And so in an emergency, I think we start from the mentality that men see an ability to react to negative circumstances by starting some other income generating activity. They can migrate to a different place. They can invest more easily in casual labor. There are different opportunities for them to generate liquidity to manage consumption in the face of an emergency. And for women, there's actually much, much less ability to do that. And so if they are going to be able to react to react resiliently, then the tool for them to do that is not the investment in new labor activity, but in savings in some form of insurance, because to react there. And I think that framing then helps us understand that these women are making very rational decisions about what would be the optimal and accessible way for them to react to the challenge. And that it's not that men are necessarily so incredibly short-sighted and only want to spend, but they have a different set of tools available to them. And then helping them see, one, I think absolutely we should be thinking about how do we ensure that more women can generate labor income as a way of being able to generate lumps and invest and provide for themselves in the face of negative circumstances. But also, how can we help men see that there are advantages in not having only additional labor as your ability to respond to challenge, so that there are advantages to that product. And so that, that interaction of the reality of circumstance with a way that products can help meet those needs for those different populations is, I think, an important way forward.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. That really puts things in perspective, and I will not attempt to summarize the discussion, but I really like the point you made about this whole household finance being a continuum, which is first you manage consumption, then move to managing investments, and then if you're able to do that, then you manage risk. I think that is really a very fresh perspective and very useful for all of us. So I will actually, unfortunately, have to wrap up the discussion now. We will take a 10 minutes break. A sincere thanks to all the research presenters and for all the hard work over the last 1 year. Thank you so much to everybody from Grameen as well as the lead team. And thank you so much, Tim, for joining us. Apologies again for the short notice and the early morning slot, but really grateful.
Thank you. And thank you to these researchers. This is fantastic work in incredibly challenging circumstances. I'm a bit in awe in what they were able to accomplish in this past year. So certainly sincere congratulations to all the researchers.
Thank you all. So we will take a 10-minute break now, and we will resume at 6 p.m. India time. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for staying on and welcome back. We would now like to move to the final agenda for today and would like to introduce Dr. Jonathan Murdoch, who has joined us today for the opening keynote speech on rethinking poverty, household finance, and microfinance. To quickly introduce Dr. Jonathan, Dr. Jonathan Murdoch is a professor of public policy and economics at the Wagner Graduate School of Public Service at New York University. Professor Jonathan's research focuses on finance, poverty, and inequality. He is a founder and executive director of NYU's Financial Access Initiative. He is also the co-author of the world-renowned book Portfolios of the Poor, How the World's Poor Live on $2 a Day, which has contributed immensely to our understanding of the financial lives and day-to-day challenges of low-income households. We're very pleased to have Dr. Jonathan for the opening keynote speech and look forward to hearing from him. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Jonathan. Thank you so much for joining.
Misha, thank you very, very much. It's really such a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Dvara. I want to thank the researchers who are presenting this week. It's really an exciting agenda, and I'm really very, very honored to be here to present some old ideas and some new ideas.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So the way we have structured the session is that we will start with your remarks, Professor Jonathan, on your chosen topic for the first 45 minutes, and then we'll move on to a question and answer session for the remaining 15 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to share some slides. So let me get those up first, and we will begin. What I'd like to do today is to narrow things. I want to think about poverty and household finance, since this is a conference on household finance. At the end, and perhaps in the Q&A, we can think about how these ideas relate to rethinking microfinance, which is ultimately one of the most important parts of my agenda. And I know a lot of people around the world and in India are also thinking about that question. But I want to start with the building blocks of that exercise, which is rethinking poverty, how we think about poverty and how we think about household finance. And as Misha said, I want to begin with some ideas from Portfolios of the Poor, which was a project that began in India and Bangladesh and South Africa and led to a book that helped us step back from kind of conventional wisdom on finance to really understand financial needs, financial strategies, financial mechanisms through the experiences of low-income people living both in cities and in rural areas. That book has led to financial diaries in many, many places, other studies in India and around the world. With Rachel Schneider and the Financial Access Initiative and Tim Ogden, we wrote a book, The Financial Diaries, which was based on the United States experience. And I'm going to talk about some of that also. So one of the reasons is that inevitably one has ideas and they evolve and they emerge. And so today I want to discuss some of the lessons from the US side as they helped us rethink or reformulate some of the ideas from Portfolios of the Poor. I'll also bring in some newer research. The starting point for financial diaries is about how we look at finance and how we look at people's lives. Just like anything, we can look from afar, we can look from a distance. This is New York City, and you can see from a distance the outlines of the famous skyline, all of the changes that are happening in New York. And that's one vision. And we often look at finance this way also. From a distance, we see the big macro elements. But we can see the world from a distance, and we can also see the world close up. And this is really what the financial diaries are trying to do. Looking and getting to know people in their homes, in their workplaces, where they live. It's a very, very different view of the world and gets us to very different places that can be put into conversation with the macro views. And so when this comes to thinking about finance specifically, when we look at finance from afar, when we look at finance from a distance, we'll often look at people's lives, and we will imagine what they need. And for example, we might look at the entire trajectory of someone's life rather than what's going on in the moment, but think about growing up, thinking about going to high school or college, the initial steps of a career, and then the eventual evolution of that career, and perhaps retiring later. And we look over the decades of a person's career, and we give advice based on how to manage that trajectory. But we get a very different story when we look close up. We see people working, we see people spending, we see people shopping, and it gives us a very different sense, and that's the financial diary sense. So from a distance, we can see these large life transitions, and the advice that we usually give is to prepare well in advance, to save slowly and steadily, like the turtle, slowly moving forward. But if we take the close view, we can see that possibility, or the ability to do that, often assumes a kind of liquidity and basic stability that many households just don't have. So the advice from the distant view is often to automate one's savings, to use a lot of behavioral tools. But as I'll discuss as we go forward, that often assumes something about the environment in which people live, and those assumptions often don't fit. Another example of this, and this is from the US side, and this is from the Federal Reserve, that if one looks to people who already have stable lives, people who already have a lot of liquidity, their focus, their financial focus, right? When we think about household finance for a typical white collar, say an engineer in America, they're thinking about those big things that we just described: retirement, college, all of those things. This is someone who's earning over $100,000 a year, which is a very solid upper middle class existence. But in the US, if we look at people who earn much less than that, something closer to our poverty line, you can see that the concerns are about bills and how am I going to put enough money together. Enough is a big word. Paying is a big word. Bills, income. It's a very, very different idea of what household finance means, what the needs are, and what's needed to move forward. And the complicated thing is that inevitably we see the world both from near and from far. We do need to keep an eye on the big decades-long needs. We also need to keep an eye on these kinds of needs. And so what I want to share today in the time that we have is what we take from the high frequency lens. And more than anything else, it is beginning with instability. For too many people around the world, month to month, week to week, life is not stable. Life is not stable in how much is earned. Life is not stable in the kinds of needs people face. It is only when one is further up the income ladder, when one has a solid salaried job, for example, that life becomes much more stable. But when we look at low-income populations especially, it's not just the feeling that income itself may not be quite enough to meet needs, but that those needs are varying and that the income itself is varying. And so instability becomes important. And that, more than anything else, is the entry point from taking this high frequency lens. What I want to then turn to today is a few ideas that come out of the earlier experiences with financial diaries, but that have evolved and been refined, at least in my mind, as we have continued on in the decade since. And that is seeing poverty as episodic, focusing more on month-to-month experiences of poverty rather than annual experiences of poverty. Seeing the need for spikes as well as for smoothing when it comes to consumption, and seeing them simultaneously. Taking lessons from behavioral economics, some of the papers in the conference this week are using some of the lessons from behavioral economics, but putting that together with this view of instability and highlighting the need for structure, as behavioral economists would have shown us, together with flexibility in the face of instability, which the high frequency lens gives us. So we're going to get there. And the final part, which I'm not going to get to in the talk, in the time that I've allotted here, I think there's already enough on the table, but is thinking about what this means for microfinance and how we see microfinance as a general purpose tool. So that's the agenda. I hope we can get through it, or through most of it. And I hope that you'll be able to see how these pieces fit together. So I want to start with the story of just one person. And this comes from financial diaries, but not financial diaries that I've helped collect. These are financial diaries that were collected by Stuart Rutherford in Bangladesh, in a different site than the original financial diaries. So in this first part of the talk, I want to draw on two data sources. One is the so-called Hrishipara financial diaries. They follow 60 diarists, just 60 people. So for those of you who are familiar with working with data sets with thousands and thousands of people, this is just 60. But the promise of financial diaries is that sometimes you can learn a lot from 60 people if you spend a lot of time with them and watch them carefully. And in fact, here I want to focus just on one person and show you her experience over time. Those 60 diarists that Stuart Rutherford's been focusing on, are indeed intensely followed. Over 6 years, he and his research team have collected nearly 1 million unique transaction records, really every financial transaction they're making, over 8 million data points. And the second data source I want to turn to is the ICRSAT monthly data from India, from the semi-arid tropics of India, and also now from Bangladesh. We're just going to focus on data from Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, and Gujarat. Again, just focusing on a subset of households, but one of the advantages, we see them over time. Now, these are farm households, so they're not typical. Broadly, they're farm households that are living in villages, but we have very, very good data on them, and I want to show you how what they're experiencing month to month, season to season, lines up with what we see of people who don't live in farm households. In fact, Hrishipara is not a farm area. And so let me begin with the Hrishipara financial diaries. Hrishipara is unusual in that this part of this village, Hrishipara, is a minority Hindu area. So the diarists are by and large Hindu. Kabani is in her early 50s. She has 2 children. Actually, now they've moved out of the house, but at the time of the study, she had 2 children. She was recently widowed and very poor because she was widowed, supporting a son who was 9 and a daughter who was age 12. So she lives in a very small house, tin-walled, tin-roofed, about 10 feet by 10 feet. And she doesn't have much land outside of that. She doesn't even have space for a latrine, so she borrows the use of her neighbor's latrine. So in itself, that gives a sense of Kabani. Increasingly in Hrishipara, housing stock is going from bamboo and thatch roofs to tin, which is a sign that the village is getting better off over time. But Kabani is at the lower part of that income distribution. Her main income comes from work in the market. She sorts vegetables. Her son brings in a little bit of money, and she patches this together with work as a maid. What I want to highlight as we look at Kabani is something about a broader idea of poverty. So here I've looked at her income over 2 years, and I've put the time horizon on the x-axis and daily income per person on the y-axis, and I've marked where the global international poverty line of $1.90 per person per day is. Okay? And I've marked two years. And to give you a sense of Kabani's position, her average spending for the year puts her just below the global poverty line. So she is part of the extreme poor that the World Bank and others track. So if we just knew this about her, and we were just looking at her annual expenditures, we would count Kabani as poor, and always poor, just below the poverty line. What I want to argue is that that view of Kobani's life holds some real truths. She is indeed poor. Insufficiency of resources is an important part of her life. But what I want to argue is that it also covers up or aggregates, smooths over other important parts of her experience of poverty. So for example, this is looking at her poverty as measured by annual average income, yearly income. But if we instead map out Kobani's income month by month, we see a very different picture. Sometimes she is much poorer than her average, and sometimes she is much better off. She earns a lot of money during Durga Puja when she receives both charitable gifts, and she also works much more because there's so much activity going on with ceremonies and celebrations in the market where she works. And so she earns a lot there and a few other times during the year, but other times she is much poorer. The averages smooth out this fundamental element of her experience of poverty. If we look at her spending, it tells a different story, a related story, but a different story where the peaks don't exactly line up, where she's spending where she doesn't always have money. And sometimes during the peaks, during the income peaks, she's able to save. So I'm going to take this apart a little. One of the things I want to highlight is that at one point, this was in December of that first year, she had to buy an electric meter. And while it looks like she's much better off because she's spending so much, in fact, that was a very difficult time because of that outlay. So I want to come back to that. But there are a few things I want to highlight about this episode or about this experience and then turn to the ICRISAT data. So one of the things is that even though Kobani was counted as poor in all of those months, if you look at her average income, in fact, if we look at 6 of the 24 months that we're focusing on, she's indeed poor and poorer than you would have thought in many of those months, the green bars. But the gray bars show that in 6 of the 24 months, she was actually not poor. She wasn't well off, but this gives us a different sense of her opportunities and her challenges. And this is really fundamental for understanding household finance and how it relates to poverty. It is this picture which really gives us a better sense of what household finance means for Kobani, how she uses it. In fact, she saves, she borrows, she shares with others in order to handle this poverty and reduce her exposure to poverty. The poverty is both really 3 elements: insufficiency, instability, that's what we see from this high frequency lens, and the household finance part, which is essentially one can sum up as illiquidity. And so that is really a beginning point. As we think about household finance and how it relates to poverty, increasingly, my view is we need to step away from annualized poverty rates, yearly poverty. While it's still very much part of the conversation, the experience of poverty can be seen much, much more clearly and lines up much, much more with the experience of low-income families themselves when we look at poverty from month to month. The annual poverty rate we just saw fails to capture those times when Kobani actually has more resources, where she can save, where she can spend, where she needs to. During Durga Puja, she bought a secondhand television. She bought a used telephone, which was very helpful. She can make purchases that you wouldn't guess perhaps if you just saw her average income and her average spending. It also fails to capture those times when her needs vary. For example, when she needed to buy the electric meter, and in general hides the peaks and valleys, which really are fundamental to her experience of poverty. Ironically, the way we think about poverty in general when we aggregate up to the year really makes sense for richer people who are able to have ample liquidity, who are able to have steadier income and needs. But lower income people like Kobani, who are fundamentally poor and face instability, that is not their life. And there's a kind of a contradiction or a paradox or an irony in how we traditionally approach poverty, and the high frequency lens makes that clear. It's these insights which really push us to sort of rethink poverty and finance and see them together. So that was Kabani, and this was the Rishipara Financial Diaries in Bangladesh. I want to turn to the semi-arid tropics of India. As I said, these are villages, this is rural areas, in particular rain-fed agriculture, so particularly dependent on the seasons, on the timing and extent of the monsoon. And as I said, in Madhya Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, and Gujarat, a selection of villages. I want to extend the conversation we just started with Kabani. If we think about people's months in poverty and their income, right? If we didn't really think harder about it, if we just had the distant view, just the annual view, we would imagine if we took a poverty line, so that to the left we have poorer people and to the right we have better off people, that if you're below the poverty line, you might think people are always in poverty. And we just saw with Kabani that that is not so, but you might assume that, and that once you go over the poverty line in terms of your annual income, your annual expenditures, you won't be in poverty anymore. You'll have exited poverty. We use that language, escape poverty, exited poverty, based on annual income or annual spending. What I want to show you, and this won't be a surprise given what we've just been saying, is that that way of thinking is not in line with what we actually see in the data. So this assumption about entering poverty and always being poor and exiting poverty and always then not being poor doesn't line up. It implies a kind of consumption smoothing, which we'll get to, that just doesn't hold in the data. This is the data. So this is the same thing. This is on the bottom, we see the income percentiles. And then we see the proportion of months in poverty. And what we don't see is a pattern that looks like the figure to the left. We don't see poor households to the left of that blue line clustered around one, where they're always poor. In fact, very, very few, just one household is up there. Nor do we see people who are out of poverty clustered at the bottom at zero. They're all over the place. And so we see, for example, this is the same chart, I just moved it to the left. We see non-poor households spending half the year with income below the poverty line. That's a very, very different story than what we're used to. And we see poor households spending half the year with income above the poverty line. Now, that's more extreme than Kabani, but these are all examples. Now, this is income. And usually we measure poverty, at least in India and many other places, by expenditure. And you might think maybe expenditure changes this story. And it does. But it doesn't radically transform it. If we look at expenditures, do we see this pattern? No, we don't see this story of always being not poor or always being poor. This is what we see. This is from the ICRISAT data. And so what we see in this work, which, as I mentioned, is joint with Josh Murfeld, is that we see more clustering as people are able to deal with some of those ups and downs, those spikes and dips. But we also see a lot of months of poverty in between, even when we're looking at the expenditure data. So I want to do one more thing to show how the experience of poverty as we measure it by the month ties to household finance. So really all of these thoughts are about bringing together household finance and poverty. So Josh Murfeld and I then took this data and we looked at poverty rates measured different ways. So we'll look at that, just the head count of poverty, the simple, are you poor or not? But we can measure it by the month, we can measure it by income, we can measure it by income by the year, expenditure by the year. And to show some key differences, we split the data by basically kind of the ability, how liquid one is. And to capture that as a proxy, we look at people who have less than primary school, generally are much poorer, or don't have such good financial tools. People who've finished primary school, who have better financial tools, and people who have secondary school or more, who have really quite good financial tools, bearing in mind that they're in these villages in the semi-arid tropics. So the first thing I want to highlight is that if we look at poverty by month and by income, all of the groups are very similar because they're all facing the ups and downs of the seasons, right? They're all tied to the agricultural economy, and poverty rates in terms of the number of months below the poverty line are around 40% for all three groups. So what's striking and what ties this, this story together is that when we look at poverty by expenditures, we're still looking at months in poverty, we start to see a different pattern. The households where the head has less than primary schooling, who are much less liquid, who have fewer financial tools to cope with this poverty, right, to deal with the ups and downs, you can see that their months of poverty are relatively unchanged. They have fewer tools to transform that income into expenditure and to smooth. But when we look at households who are a little better off, who've got some primary education, we can see that the months of poverty they're exposed to in terms of their expenditure, their ability to spend, have gone down a bit. And that's especially true for better off households. Before going forward, I just want to highlight something important here. That the poverty levels is measured by insufficiency, by yearly income. We know that people with more education and other markers of higher socioeconomic status, they're less poor. They're less poor in terms of their overall earning power, their place in the income distribution, and even in terms of their months of poverty as measured by spending. But there's another element that this high frequency view is showing, which is that they're also less poor because they have better tools to deal with ups and downs, and they can reduce the exposure to poverty month by month by using those tools. So they're both advantaged in terms of sufficiency of resources and also the ability to address instability, or the ability to be liquid and to use liquidity. That's the part that's often hidden. And one of the things it will show us is that household finance, by expanding access to liquidity, can reduce exposure to poverty even when people's income overall doesn't change, simply by allowing people to smooth to deal with ups and downs much better. And there's a way that we can see this is by looking at expenditure measured by the year. And as I said, when we look at the year, it's assuming that households have perfect liquidity and can perfectly smooth. And here you can see that, was that possible? The exposure to poverty by the poorest in the sample would be reduced from 42% down to 31%, and it would also come down for others. So nobody is perfectly smoothing here, but the ability to smooth, the ability to move resources around, the ability to deal with those months of deprivation is an important element of protecting oneself from the experience of poverty, even without a change in overall earnings. That, in many ways, is the power of household finance here, to move closer to something like this. Okay, so that's the first thing I wanted to highlight, which is how we think about household finance and poverty, and suggesting that we should take a high frequency lens there. And the world looks very different when we look at poverty by the season or by the month. It changes how we think about household finance. The second thing I want to talk about then is smoothing. I've been using that word smoothing a lot, the ability to smooth, but I also want to highlight this other element which also gets lost, which is what we call spiking, or just what Stuart Rutherford calls aggregating meaningfully large sums. And what I want to argue here about household finance is that we also see something of a sort of contradiction or a tension, that households both want to smooth, right, to deal with those ups and downs, but also want to spike. They want to create moments when they have spikes, peaks, big lumps of money to do meaningfully big things. Those could be investing in business. It could be buying tickets to travel. It could be paying for healthcare. It could be many things. As I mentioned with Kabani, she bought a used television. She bought a telephone, a mobile telephone, when she had money around Durga Puja. Those moments of spiking are really as important as those moments of smoothing. And we tend to get into the smoothing mindset when the spikes also matter. So let me just say a few things really quickly. I mean, the logic for this comes from Milton Friedman's permanent income hypothesis in terms of formalizations. We have more sophisticated mathematical approaches, dynamic intertemporal, stochastic optimization, but the elements are really there with Milton Friedman. Essentially, his story is your income goes up and down. You want to maintain a much smoother level of consumption or spending so that the correlation of your income ups and downs shouldn't drive your consumption patterns. A very simple way of seeing this is your income goes up and down, but you want to try to keep your spending flatter. And what this means for household finance is that there's a lot of short-term saving, save when you've got more money, and then just saving, or you may be borrowing and repaying. That's basically the element. And smoothing is all about that flat, that flatter pattern of spending. So that's really a very simple view of it. In reality, it looks very different. I'll show you some real data, but we also associate this conversation with Angus Deaton, drawing on his work in India. But this is a simulation, and you can see in this simulation, income is bouncing all over the place, just like what we saw with Kabani, but this is much more high frequency. Assets going up and down, as Friedman described, saving and dissaving, and consumption in the end, much smoother, fewer jaggedy ups and downs. If you look at the coefficient of variation, it cut by about half simply by saving and dissaving. This is the logic we take into trying to understand household finance and village life. And in fact, when Josh Murfeld and I look at, this is an example from ICRSAT, look at the data, this is a single household, you can see that, this is Deaton's graph, but you can see it's not so different from what we see. The purple line here is spending, and the blue line here is income. Income's going up and down, but spending is relatively smooth. So we see a lot of instability, just as we've been arguing, but considerable success at consumption smoothing. So all of this makes sense, but I want to bring it back to Kabani. This is going back to Kabani from her village in Bangladesh. She's not as I said, not a farm worker. Her livelihood's not tied to farming, but she also needs spikes. She took advantage of the spike at Durga Puja. She also had a spike that she had to figure out when she had to install an electric meter. She had been borrowing a line from her neighbors, and then the local government said she had to install an electric meter. It was expensive and very challenging. And so creating spikes becomes a very, very important and difficult task. And we saw it in Kabani's life, but we see it more generally. There really are two different saving problems: smoothing, trying to flatten it out, and spiking like this. And spiking is so challenging that people are willing to pay to save. For example, I want to give I think I have time for this, a really quick example from a paper from Pakistan, which is a set of artifactual field experiments. So this is just kind of an artificial environment where a group of researchers created an experiment, a field experiment, not an RCT, but a sort of hypothetical experiment where they gave people actual stakes over a week of essentially giving the choice to borrow or save, and how to borrow and save, at what terms, at what prices. And so, for example, we can see borrowing in this case, we've got 6 days. On the first day, they got 900 rupees, and then they pay it off 200 rupees a day. So they pay 1,000 rupees in order to receive that 900 rupees. So that's essentially, there's an interest rate of 100 rupees to be able to borrow. And you can see the same thing with saving, the second example below, putting in 200 rupees a day, getting 1,100 rupees. So it's saving with an interest rate of 100 rupees. What's interesting is that they mixed things up. So the interest rates would be positive and negative. And this is one I would just want to highlight because it sort of simply captures what we see in lots of other circumstances, which is when people were offered the chance to save 200 rupees a day, but they only got back 900 rupees. They were taxed 100 rupees. They had to pay to save. Neoclassical economics would predict that no one would be interested in that. No one would want to have this savings contract where they actually pay to save. But in fact, about half of the people, when offered this, accepted this contract because that structure and that help in saving was so valuable, because spiking was so valuable. So people were willing to pay to save, and this shows it very clearly. And one can imagine people like Keynote paying to save as well. And in fact, we see this with deposit collectors and other kind of informal mechanisms like that. But the point I want to raise is that people pay to save, and people pay to save because spiking, aggregating meaningfully large sums, is so valuable. And that these two activities, smoothing and spiking, are very different savings problems. In the work in Pakistan, they then ask, why do people want to save? And you can see what people are doing. The number one activity is buying an appliance for the home. And this is exactly what Keynote did. She bought a used television, but also clothing, wedding celebration, medical expenses. We lose track of these needs to spike as we focus on smoothing. But they are really part of the same problem, and they are very different problems. And what I want to leave this part of the conversation with is this notion, is that spiking is actually essential for consumption smoothing. And that's because spending and consumption are not the same thing. Right? Milton Friedman's model is actually a model of consumption, but the data we actually have is often spending data. The difference between spending and consumption are different. I mean, if we're eating, then spending and consumption are the same thing. We go and we go to a tea stall, we buy some tea and we consume it, then they're exactly the same thing. But think about buying the appliance for the home. Think about Keynote's television or her mobile phone. She's spending in a spike. She has a spending spike, a need for that spending spike. But her consumption of that telephone, of that television, and here of these appliances goes on over a long time. Her consumption is actually smooth, even though the spending implications are spiky. Spiking is needed, is essential for smoothing consumption. And by seeing spending and consumption distinctly, and that's really what a high frequency lens helps us do, we can see that a lot of our intuition, which is about smoothing consumption, is correct. But consumption is not spending. And once we see spending, then we often see the need for spiking. So I hope that wasn't too confusing, but this is really an important element that's coming out of this high frequency lens. And the final part is just one way that we're putting this to work is some work on a UBI, a universal basic income, that I'm currently involved in, has just started in California, in Los Angeles County. Right, so that red dot there, right in the middle of Los Angeles County, is the city of Compton, California. It's a poor area. 30% of the residents are Black, about 70% are Latino. The poverty rate is about a quarter relative to the US poverty rate before COVID, which is about 10%. It's a city of about 100,000 people, so relatively small. The mayor came in and wanted to do something meaningful for the city, and she created an idea called the Compton Pledge. And it was really about guaranteed income, or kind of a universal basic income, but targeted at poorer households. And really just what I want to highlight here really quickly is that she made a distinction, and we've made a distinction in how we design guaranteed income. So about 2,100 households are in the study. About 800 are receiving money as part of a randomized control trial to see if it works. But rather than giving everybody the same money and the same frequency, we're taking seriously this idea that people need to smooth and spike. So half of the treatment group is essentially smoothing. We're giving them $300 a week, so $7,200 over the year, but $300, every 2 weeks, $300 24 times a year. And the other part of the treatment group, we're giving $1,800, a much bigger lump, but giving it quarterly. So I can't tell you what the results are. We won't know for 2 years, but this is an attempt to implement these ideas that households need to smooth and spike, and this will give us a sense of which, if one had to choose, will be more important. I think what's important to hold on to, though, in reality, is that both matter simultaneously, and that helps to explain some of the often contradictory behaviors that we see in people's lives. So, one more thing. We just talked about smoothing and spiking. We've talked about monthly poverty. In the last 5 minutes, I want to quickly talk about structure and flexibility. This is something that became clearer as we did the US financial diaries. And there's a lot of work, RCTs, some of it in India, some in other parts of the world, trying to get at this notion. So you need to spike, right? There's poverty, there's smoothing and spiking, people need to spike. And often in order to spike, in order to create these usefully large sums, we think about the need for structure. We think about the need, and behavioral economics has taught us this, the need to have a commitment savings device or something that allows us to, or allows people to build up their savings over time, right? For me, with my retirement, my structure is at NYU, New York University, takes money out of my income every month and puts it into a retirement account. It's very, very structured. That works for me because I'm a salaried employee and I have resources, some slack, to deal with things that come up. But if I didn't have those resources, if the amount of slack that I had in my life, my financial life, was much more narrow, if I had difficulty making ends meet, that kind of structure could be a real problem. The instability that many people face create a need for flexibility. And these things are often at odds, structure and flexibility. I'll give you an example, but this is another challenge of household finance and is a way that household finance can help households meet complicated needs. So this comes from the US Financial Diaries. The book is called The Financial Diaries, How American Families Cope in a World of Uncertainty. It came out in 2017. We followed households in different parts of the United States, including California, but also Mississippi, Kentucky, and New York. And I want to briefly tell you the story of a woman in Mississippi. Her name is Janice. She is an older woman. She's in her 50s, and she works as a card dealer at a casino. So there's gambling and legalized gambling in Mississippi. She goes to church. She's a very religious woman, and she does not like gambling. She doesn't like the idea that people gamble. She doesn't gamble. But working at the casino as a card dealer is a good job, and so she's happy for the job. But it turns out, and this is a picture of a typical casino, it turns out that her income is tied up with the incomes of the gambler. Their ups and downs translate into her ups and downs, because if there are a lot of gamblers at the casino, then she's given more tips. A lot of her income comes from tips, comes from gamblers feeling grateful when they're winning, and they put more money in her tip jar, which is right on her table where she's dealing cards. So when there are more gamblers in the casino, when they're doing well, she's doing well. And what we can see is a picture of her income over a year-long period. And it doesn't look that different from Kabani's. It doesn't look that different from what we saw in the Ikarsat villages in India, ups and downs. And it doesn't look that different from a lot of the households we saw in other parts of the United States. The mechanisms for the instability are different, but the instability is there. In her case, she earns a lot in the summer because that's when everyone's at the casino, everyone's gambling. In the fall, the kids go back to school, people's children go back to school, and there's a need for back to school shopping, and people are watching television. American football is on television, so they're not at the casino, they're staying home and watching television, watching football. That's all part of the rhythm of life. But as you can see, Janice sees it in her paychecks, her actual income. Her average income is the red line. And you can see it would be very flat, but she doesn't earn that average. She earns around that average, the black line, and the winter is very difficult. Sometimes, she has just very little to make ends meet. And in fact, when Christmas came around, she didn't really have much money for giving gifts to her family. So that instability is broader. And what I want to share, just the very last thing, is that this creates a tension or illustrates a tension that I think often gets lost when we take lessons from behavioral economics, which as I said, is often all about helping people save by creating commitment and creating structure. Now, Janice, if you look at her life here, she has these ups and downs, and really what she wants to do is save during the summer, and in the fall and the winter months, be able to withdraw. So she sees the need for saving and she wants to save. But with Janice, she realized that her bank, the bank that she had, was too convenient, too flexible. So an irony, she had a bank, but it was too tempting because the bank made it too easy to withdraw money, and she would often withdraw money and then not have money for the later months in winter. So Janice did something interesting. She opened an account at a bank that was about an hour drive away, and it had bad hours. And when she didn't open for very long, so it was quite inconvenient. It was an hour and away, and it had not very good hours. And when they sent her an ATM card that would make it more convenient, she took her scissors and she cut it in half. She did not want the convenience. But at the same time, she didn't want all the structure. She wanted to know that at any time she could drive an hour and she could go to that bank and she could get the money she needed. She just needed an optimal amount of inconvenience, not total structure, not total flexibility, but some balance. And that is what many households I see are struggling with. It's very hard to find in the same financial product. So what Janice did was to cobble together a balance of structure and flexibility using conventional products in unconventional ways. Other people do it in other ways by overlapping different kinds of products and creating a portfolio that works. But we need more attention to these paradoxes, and they're often most easy to see when we focus on a high frequency lens to people's lives, to people's financial lives. And we really pay attention to people who are struggling to make ends meet. So to sum things up, I'll just end on this final slide. That high frequency lens is really important. It allows us to see instability that the annual lens hides, that the annual lens covers up, the yearly aggregates, the yearly spending and income. It allows us to see poverty as episodic, moving in and out from month to month. It allows us to see the importance of consumption smoothing and spiking. It allows us to rethink behavioral saving, some of the early ideas around structure. It allows us to see how important it is to also have flexibility. And the one part that we didn't have a chance to really talk about is how this then helps us rethink microfinance. So I will end there, but I hope these pieces are coherent and come together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Jonathan. I can't tell you how immensely useful that is for researchers like us sitting in India working on understanding the lives of low-income households. I think your talk was really eye-opening for us at Dvara Research, as well as I'm sure for other audiences listening in. So we have a set of questions, Professor Jonathan. In the interest of time, I'll just roll with those if that's okay with you. So we have one question. We don't have the name. It's by Amar Bhal, and the question is: microfinance is important enabler, but in vulnerable sections, there's also challenge of debt burden. What's your perspective as you have seen both sides as academician and practitioner? So I think your views on the topic of over indebtedness that is talked about quite widely in the context of microfinance. That's something we've not touched in your talk today, but nevertheless an interesting question.
Yeah, thank you, Misha. And thank you, Amar Bal, for the question. Two thoughts on debt burdens that connect to what we've just been talking about. One, the debt burdens are often, I should say, borne by women. And we see this in village level work in India, that we are concerned with debt burdens growing, but we also should pay attention to how unequally they are felt. Often women are then who are kind of given microfinance or seen as key customers for microfinance, which is seen as empowering, but then within the household dynamics, they're often made responsible or take the responsibility for managing household finances. And that can be very stressful and difficult, and it falls on their shoulders. So there's a gendered element to debt burdens. But the other element to sort of connect to all these pieces is that we don't see that debt burden until we sort of take this broader view of microfinance as not just being about business. If we just see microfinance as being a business loan, it's hard to imagine debt burdens because money is being profitably used for business. But once we look at the need for structure and flexibility and smoothing and spiking and how microfinance can play such an important role in managing finances and doing all kinds of, providing all kinds of meeting all kinds of consumer needs, we can then see how debt burdens arise. And it's important, but it's been hidden from view, I think, because of the way we've seen microfinance. All I can say is that this is an issue that we need to spend a lot more time with. We need more regulation. We need better consumer protection. I don't have anything more to say about it than what thoughtful people, including at Dvara and many other places, are already saying. It's just, it needs to be a much bigger issue in people's consciousness. We've got to move away from microfinance as being all about business to see it as essentially a consumer finance tool. And once we do that, it's easier to have a conversation about debt burden.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. Another question we have actually on your point about the need for spiking, right? So the question is, does the preference vary depending on the spike? Willing to take negative savings rate for consumer durables? Will this behavior hold for health as well? So depending on the purpose for which you want to spike, will the consumer be willing to take negative savings rate?
Yeah, that was a great question. And yes, obviously, the urgency matters a lot if you're talking about negative interest rates for saving. One of the things which this raises is that often, for example, for healthcare, we often think, and there was a Dvara primer, a very nice savings primer for the conference that came out maybe a week or two ago, or was circulated a week or two ago, that focused on focused on saving for things like health. One of the things that we see in terms of spiking is that it's often not just savings, it's saving and borrowing, or sometimes just borrowing for saving, but often it's both. And I think increasingly we need to see borrowing and saving as tools that are used at the same time, right? Neoclassical economics tells us we have saving if you're patient, or borrowing if you're impatient. But what we see from the high frequency lens and from financial diaries is that actually both are together. Having a base of savings makes it easier to borrow less, but also being able to borrow makes it more appealing to save, because you know that you can kind of meet your needs fully by being able to borrow to complete the deal. Health is one of those things which is both urgent, but where kind of half the amount won't solve your problem. You need the full amount. So it's not just spikes in terms of big amounts of money, but it's often indivisible spending. And when that's true, yes, you're often willing to save. So it's not just, you're often willing to pay. It's not just urgency, it's also indivisibility. And it's also about the other resources you have to sort of complete the deal. That's really, taking a portfolio lens really helps us understand that element.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We have another comment, interesting comment here. It says, great learning opportunity through this presentation. I'm curious to know how you see the decision maker here from the point of view of rationality and information asymmetry or symmetry.
So I'm an economist. And so even though I spend a lot of time with households, and I see households have lots and lots of rationales for doing things, I come with a frame of rationality. And when households are making choices I don't understand, my usual kind of mode that I learned in graduate school and I think has served me well is to then look at information asymmetries, look at constraints, try to understand the hidden logic, which is often a question not of people's preferences, but of people's constraints. And so, yes, asymmetries of information are really important. But I think the asymmetries of information are, let me try to put it this way, can also lead us astray if we just take that lens. You know, when I was in graduate school, I learned lots of models, Kolchak Basu, Joseph Stiglitz, you know, of asymmetric information and how it limits, say, credit markets, all built around ex-ante moral hazard. I think what we see with a high frequency lens is that those models, those neoclassical models, may not be as appropriate as a different kind of model, which would be ex post moral hazard, where people borrow, but it's not, the problem is that they, or they want to borrow, the problem is not that they, you know, their effort is unobserved, as in the standard models. You know, the fear is they won't put enough effort to make the project successful. The problem is often they put in the effort. The project is successful. But when it comes time to pay, something else has come up. A health problem. Someone needs to go to the city and they need a bus ticket immediately. It's ex post moral hazard. And even the language of ex post moral hazard is wrong. It's, you know, it's all about strategic default, but it implies that there's something wrong with the choice. Whereas in fact, what we see with a high frequency lens, what we see when we understand instability is that households often rationally have difficult choices and trade-offs, and they rationally may default on loans because life is compelling and urgent and difficult. It's not their problem, it's the choice that you would make, I would make. And so those the lenses that come from neoclassical economics and asymmetric information, they're really helpful. They guide a lot of my thinking. But I've also had to unthink them and look to other models to really understand. And ex post moral hazard is a really, really important part of kind of rethinking those frameworks.
Yeah. So Professor Jonathan, I would like to close by one last question, which is that, you know, you spoke about how, I think you cited a research in Pakistan and you said that households are actually willing to save, right? And research after research, I think now it's quite evident that low-income households do want to save. They do save. It's just that they don't save in formal financial instruments that you and I would typically use. And it's just so, if I may use the word cruel and heartbreaking to note that they have to pay so much amount of money to actually be able to create those spikes that they so essentially need. If I can ask you, how would you summarize this problem? Why is this demand not being met by financial service providers? I mean, one sort of promising intervention that we hear in this context is around commitment savings devices, right? I fully take that point, and it is to do with you know, the behavioral factors that are into play. But what about the fact that there are simply no products that are suitable for low-income households that are available beyond behavioral factors? What about, you know, the simple convenience of the availability of the product? Could you summarize how you would see this problem and where we are lacking as a sector, and why till date, even in spite of all of these research, we've not been able to meet this demand? I think that would be my closing question.
And that's a really important question. And if we had all day, I'd love to talk much more about this. But let me just highlight a few things in the minute that we have. One, I think it's a failure of imagination. Misha, you see the problem and you can articulate it very well, but I wish that everybody had your understanding of the problem. And I think a lot of the people working in banks, working in the financial sector, still have this idea that people cannot save, poor people cannot save, even though the research is very clear on this. I think seeing, Kabani, very poor, but still being able to save and saving, as you said, informally, is really important. One of the key issues is that the saving that people often want to do and need to do and to build up the spikes is short-term saving. It's not long-term saving, for retirement or for college, that people want to do some of that too. It's cyclical saving. It's very hard saving. And so banks who take this money, who would take these deposits, they'd often see, the money being built up and taken down. It wouldn't give them money to, take and invest in the stock market and earn a profit. The business model for this kind of saving is probably the biggest challenge. But the other challenge, and one that I highlighted in the talk, is, Misha, you're absolutely right? Commitment savings products really can be helpful. And yet, with the instability, they're often what people don't want, because there's too much commitment, there's too much structure. And what people are trying to figure out is a different kind of saving product where they have commitment, but they also have flexibility. They can pull money out. They can undo the commitment. That's a really hard thing to design. I don't know a lot of savings products that do that well. You can think of a few examples. If we had time, we could talk more about them. But that, I think, is the problem. The products aren't really great yet. The business model isn't great yet. And yet the need is so important. And I hope that this conference, maybe this is a nice way to end, will lead to new ideas, which might help solve this really fundamental problem. But the first step to solving it is really seeing it, and that involves seeing smoothing and spiking structure and flexibility.
Yeah. Actually, one last question on what you just said. I'm sorry to keep you waiting.
Misha, I could talk all day.
Is there a real world financial product that you're excited about from the structure/flexibility perspective, since it's quite linked to what you just said? If you can close with that question, please.
Yeah, that's a nice question. I mean, the answer is yes and no. I mean, one interesting product that Stuart Rutherford designed, which is actually being implemented in the village of Rishipara, is something he calls P9. So he's both a researcher and he's run a microfinance institution in Bangladesh. This thing P9 is a weird product, but it does try to get at structure and flexibility. And it works like this. Like Misha, I would say, I've got this new product and we're going to start off, you get an interest-free loan. Okay. The moment that you repay that interest-free loan, you're going to keep on providing money, but I'm going to lock that money up. And so that's going to become a commitment savings device. But after you've locked up a certain amount of money, I'm going to give you another interest-free loan. And then we're going to continue doing this. So it's a sort of, this product involves a sequence, a very structured sequence of interest-free loans together with commitment savings. Puts them together, which is a weird thing. It's a saving and borrowing product, but it's free loans. After a while, ultimately, you're borrowing your own money. So for SafeSave, it's actually, they can make money from this because they can then invest. But for the household, it's actually very powerful because they're continually getting these infusions of liquidity in the form of interest-free loans, which is allowing them to feel comfortable building up this commitment savings device. It's been very popular, but it's just one idea, and I'm sure there are other ideas that could be built.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Professor Jonathan. I think we can wrap up with that. And thank you so much for giving us your time today, for sharing with us all your knowledge about the role of household finance for low-income households. We've taken detailed notes and hope to implement it in our work at Dvara and broadly as well.
Thank you so much. It's really been such an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. With that, we will close the session for today, and we'll look forward to having you all join us tomorrow, which is day 2 of the session at 4 p.m. Thank you all. Have a good evening.